Good morning, everyone. My apologies for the delay. Thank you for joining today's webinar briefing. And I'll also thank my colleagues on the line, Uri Dromi, CEO of the Jerusalem Press Club, and our newest member of the team, Eli Klutstein, who is the new press coordinator. So thank you for being here. With countries trying to determine their next step in the seemingly never-ending battle against COVID-19, Israel approved several restrictions earlier in the week in its efforts to prevent the spread of the South African variant within its borders. Meanwhile, a national campaign to vaccinate younger children continues slowly. With us to help understand the medical community's recommendations and perhaps provide insight about what lies ahead is Professor Balicer, chairman of the Israeli National Expert Advisory Committee on COVID-19 Response and chief innovation officer of the Clalit Health Services. Thank you for joining us during what I assume are very busy days, Professor.
Indeed, but it's really a pleasure and privilege.
So we'll begin with the latest news. The CEO of Moderna was just quoted as saying he was skeptical of the current vaccine's efficacy against the strain. What is your opinion on this?
I do not think opinions have much to do with that. There are different estimates that we've heard today, one from the CEO of Moderna and one from the CEO of Pfizer. I'm not in a position to mark them. All I can say is that these estimates eventually will, we hope to be receiving the scientific evidence coming from the laboratory testing that these companies are producing, and I will be able to comment on that then.
Okay, that's fair. What about the Shin Bet's tracking of people suspected of carrying it? Are you in favor of this move?
I think what is being done, and I think that the identity of the organization that actually performs this tracking is kind of the controversial aspect. But in its basic essence, the fact that you are judiciously using a tracking ability on a very small number of first and only cases of a threatening strain during an emergency situation, I think it is a balancing act of the needs of public health and the basic right for privacy. And I think that overall, this seems to strike a balance. This is very different from the use of tracking capability that was done before on a mass of many different people that have been either shown to be carriers or positives, and we were talking at the time in hundreds and thousands of people. And right now we're talking about a number of people that you can basically count on two hands. And this is a public health emergency. And this is the only means that is capable of allowing us to properly track those people and help the people that they have contacted. So I think this seems reasonable, although I do understand the aim to refrain to the extent possible from using these measures unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think it seems absolutely necessary at this point.
Okay, so let's discuss another measure, which is closing the borders themselves. How long should foreigners be expected to be prevented from entering the country? We have a lot of foreign press on the line with plans to have left or returned. What are your estimates?
I think that we will need to have some clarity before we will be able to change this policy. This clarity could stem either from sound scientific information that will tell us that we need not worry as much from this emerging variant. So this could be one thing that would drive us to change this policy. Another would be a higher level of clarity on local dissemination patterns in many countries. Right now, we know that our colleagues in other countries are not able to fully track and know which of their population is currently carrying, and to have a clear view on local transmission And this is something that's being elucidated on a daily basis. So that they do not have practical means of accounting for the full level of local transmission to allow us a more gradual approach, which is what we would like. So with this opacity of information about local transmission, it's difficult to have a differential approach, and we have to take this blanket approach for now. Once the data from different countries will become clearer, I think that will be another driving force in changing our policy into a more specific one.
Okay, in terms of learning about the variant itself, as you said, one of the, I can't remember her name exactly, but one of the doctors involved in South Africa on this specific variant said to Channel 2 yesterday that that the cases themselves were not as problematic, that people aren't as sick as in previous variants. Is this something that you think is true? Does it have to do with those who are vaccinated? Do you have any clarity on that?
I think, as we said about 3 or 4 days ago, I wrote a commentary and I said the coming 2 weeks will be filled with notions, personal impressions, partial data sets, and a lot of ambiguous data coming in. Some will say that this is really a serious problem, more than we have even anticipated, and others would drive us the exact opposite way. And I think we should maintain course until we know something that is data-driven and scientifically assessed and peer-reviewed and properly that we can really substantiate, and we cannot move back and forth. The estimate that you just mentioned before about on one hand and this estimate on the other, we need to go beyond these into scientific data that would allow us to drive proper informed decision making. So I cannot comment on any of these impressions or partial data sets because we know these things change, and it is the normal for the first weeks of a new variant to have a mist and to not be able to say things in certainty, and we really need to be patient, and we need to wait until such data accumulates.
Okay, very, very clear. So we'll move on to some other issues. Let's talk about vaccination in Israel, because it's something that we can see for ourselves. Can you tell us what the current status of efforts to vaccinate children between 5 and 10 is right now? Are Israelis cooperating?
So the vaccination campaign is continuing on course. The uptake seems reasonably good, not different from what we've seen, maybe even better than what we've seen with the adolescents vaccination campaign in terms of the rates and the uptake. We do believe this will take time. This will not be a very swift vaccination campaign, and this could be expected. There's also the logistical challenges of vaccinating younger kids that require their active parents' participation, which makes things a little bit more complex. Still, I think we're on course, and I think overall we hopefully are able to convey the message to the public that their informed decision right now, with the state of affairs being with Delta surging in Europe and threatening to surge here as well, with 1/3 of the population here in Israel still vulnerable. And regardless of Omicron, so Omicron is a separate threat, which is important. But when we look at Europe and what's happening right now, what's surging and causing significant morbidity and mortality is not Omicron, it's Delta. Delta is still a threat. And in a country like Israel, with 1/3 of the population vulnerable, there's no reason to believe that Delta cannot surge yet again if we do not continue our efforts. And in tackling COVID-19, if there's something we've learned, is that there's no single magic bullet. The key component of our efforts to maintain and prevent surges has and will be vaccinations. But aside vaccinations, we need a combination of measures working in parallel. So vaccination campaigns are one. And when I'm saying vaccinations, it's first vaccinations for the kids, but in parallel, the booster 3-dose effort for all of the population that are eligible. I will mention that out of the 5 million eligible people in Israel, 4 approximately have already been vaccinated, and there's 1 million that should be taking the booster, and we're making great strides in order to encourage uptake and making this final phase of the vaccination campaign reach completion. And so vaccination is one component. The second component is indoor mask mandate, which we should continue to ascertain, and it's difficult, but it is important. And the third component, which is really important, is that of vaccine certificates, the green badges, as they're called. And the vaccine certificates are really important in order to provide safe environment for people coming in for an indoor activity to be able to participate with low risk of infection. And so we hold the approach that says that you need to be either fully vaccinated or to have a recent test in order to enter events of over 50 people indoors. And I think this is the right approach, complementing the other measures. And if we will continue to adhere to these measures, hopefully we will be able to prevent or contain the potential of a fifth wave caused by Delta. And about Omicron, I will probably comment more later.
Okay, another question about tracking, not putting the Shin Bet tool aside. Someone is asking if any tracking is occurring right now. Beyond that, is the Magen app still being used? Are we seeing any of these tools being used as well? And another follow-up question to that is, do you think it should remain voluntary, or would it help if this would become mandatory?
So again, this is a very delicate balance that we need to uphold all the time. I think this merits a discussion. I think that Delta does not is not an impetus important enough in order to drive personal tracking, but Omicron might be. So we need to wait and see how this unfolds before we hold these discussions. The key means of epidemiological investigation are investigation teams run by the Alon command team that have their epidemiological tracking staff that are doing manual, very labor-intensive work in order to reach every one of these cases and work on the chain of transmission in order to cut it as early as possible. This is the key component that we're still using. This is what we hope will be able to help us both on a daily basis working on containing Delta, but especially now with the special teams working on the specific cases of Omicron to prevent local transmission.
Okay, you talked a little bit about the three-step vaccination. One reporter is asking what if we can expect a fourth booster shot in the future, and do you think that Israelis would take advantage of that?
So we have the advantage and disadvantage that we have been the first to provide the vaccines in the first place in December 2020 and onwards, and with a very swift vaccination campaign, which is why we were the first country in the world to see the impact of waning immunity back in June, July of 2021. And this is why we saw the wave that occurred among those previously vaccinated but now waned immunity individuals, and were first to institute the booster vaccination campaign, which gradually, by now, most of the countries are now adapting to our policy that we were obliged to be first to put in place. This means that if there is waning immunity, always there is waning immunity, but if there's a significant waning immunity of the third booster dose, we will likely be the first ones to experience it on a massive scale and to be needing to take decisions accordingly. We have not yet have had evidence of this taking place, but not enough time probably has elapsed in order to see that. So we keep a watchful eye on and continuously monitoring these cases, severe cases and infections among the people that have been vaccinated, including the 3-dose vaccination, and we will continue to assess. And if and when we will see significant waning immunity happening, I see no reason why we shouldn't consider another booster dose as needed. And again, it is not clear that it will be needed. It is not clear when it will be needed. We need to follow, but if I had to guess, I would imagine that we will see at some point waning immunity, that it will last, the impact of the third dose will last longer than the second dose did, but that at some point we will need, for at least part of the population, to consider again boosting.
The follow-up question to that is really the cooperation of Israelis, because we see that at least from year to year, the diligence in terms of getting a flu vaccine on an annual basis is very low in Israel. So if we look at that in the same way as COVID might be a regular vaccine, will we see similar behavior, in your opinion?
Israelis take the flu vaccine every year, and they have very good adherence to that, relatively. It really comes to this point in which we will need to make an informed, risk-benefit assessment in each and every time in the different age groups. This will be different by age group, probably. This will be different by risk group, probably. And so different decisions will be made for different population subgroups, and this will also impact their willingness to have a good uptake. But it is too early, really, to discuss this before we have good, strong evidence of waning immunity that has clinical impact.
Okay, one reporter is asking where physically the Israeli health community tests the various coronavirus variants. Does it have a central laboratory, or is it the responsibility of the HMOs or the hospitals? And a second question from the same reporter, if you could address, is whether Israeli labs are also testing samples from the West Bank and Gaza, or is it completely separate?
The answer to the first question is that Israel does have a central viral laboratory by the Ministry of Health that in many instances does many of these assessments, but there are specific scientific work groups working on different lab assessments in different hospitals and academic centers. So I cannot tell you exactly which project happens where, and I do not know the answer for the second question. A representative of the Ministry of Health would be more informed to be able to say the answer for that.
Sure, and we're happy to make that connection if that's necessary. A few more follow-up questions on the science itself. One reporter is asking if there's a way to evaluate the when the third dose becomes weaker without actually waiting for an outbreak. What is the other way to measure it without the disease spreading?
The other way to do that is to follow up on level of antibodies and potentially also cellular immunity among people who have been vaccinated. And so you need a cohort of people that has received the third booster dose, and you follow up in a systematic way, and you test for their specific types of antibodies that are called neutralizing antibodies, because they have the capacity of stopping the virus. And in lab environments, you can estimate this in a quantitative way, and you can watch the quantitative decline over time and compare this to what we saw in the previous waves, and whether at which level one had seen also a clinical breakthrough above and beyond the laboratory signals. So there's a strong association between some of these lab markers and clinical breakthrough evidence in eventually, but these are not perfect. And so these are only hinting signs of waning immunity, and only actual morbidity assessment in those various groups and an increase in breakthrough cases is the best evidence to tell you of the level of waning. Okay, and we are continuously monitoring that.
Good to hear. Keeping in mind the statistics that you've already discussed, one reporter is asking, well, first stating that we know that variants are especially likely to appear in areas where there are large numbers of unvaccinated people. So keeping in mind what you've already told us, do you think that Israel is a risk in this case compared to other countries in terms of the ability for the new variant to spread?
Emergence of new variants is a statistical phenomenon that is, there's a lot of aspects associated with it. The likelihood of a new variant coming out of a small country like Israel is quite small because of the sheer numbers. It would make sense that where majority of the infections take place is where you will see majority of the potential mutations and variant formation. It's hardly unlikely that it will appear for the first time here in Israel.
Okay, and we're almost out of time, so just a few quick questions that are left before we let you go. One reporter is asking about the next age group. We have under fives still left to vaccinate, toddlers and babies. Do you foresee a time that the vaccination will be available to them at any point?
To kids younger than 5?
Yes.
So there are currently clinical trials being run by some of the vaccine manufacturers. If and when a clinical trial will show the efficacy and safety of the vaccines and will receive regulatory approvals of the key regulatory agencies globally, that would be a good time to consider providing these vaccines, approving them in Israel and providing them to the younger population as well. This will take time.
Ballpark figure, month, year?
It's their internal information. It's their cohorts being run. I know there are such trials ongoing. I do not know, they have not made public of a specific date in which those will be concluded and data will be published. So I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, and just two more questions. One regarding an issue we already discussed. The flu season has actually already begun, but we've heard nothing from the health ministry, which is, as usual, is doing campaigns on COVID, and justifiably so. But what does that mean in terms of the flu situation in Israel?
So I think we are seeing what is normal for the season. We haven't seen large outbreaks, as I know some other countries have experienced. But again, this is a little early. In most years, we see our flu outbreaks between December and February. And so I would expect that this year will not be different. We do not expect to see a low flu season as we did in last year. Because some of the behavioral aspects do no longer exist. So I think we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, I promised two more questions before this question, but now I'm promising two questions for real. One reporter is asking about threats being made to health officials, members of the health community. Everybody obviously knows the case of threats being made against Dr. Shonan Rui-Price. Is this something that you're seeing any of in the last few weeks, or is it subsided?
It's difficult to say that it's subsided because they continue. I think that we also heard yesterday of another physician, a pediatrician, that has been receiving specific threats after supporting childhood vaccination campaigns. I think this is a very sad thing to see, and I think it should be dealt with the appropriate measures laid down by the law, and people should be deterred from making such threats in a way that is very decisive to prevent this. I know this is not a unique phenomena here in Israel. I've heard and read about similar things happening in different countries. This is a very emotional topic, and some of the people actually are dramatically crossing the thin line between informing their opinion and making it public, and insulting, threatening public workers who are working on their best judgment in order to do the best that they can to keep the population healthy and to provide the best health advice that they can. And I think that is not something that any country should find acceptable.
Of course. And just a final question, feel free to decline. You've been working on this issue for several years now. You've been accompanying the crisis since it broke out. Do you see any difference between the way in which those you are advising, i.e. the government, is this time around than in the previous government, in terms of listening to your advice and applying your policy recommendations?
I think that every government in Israel was very much attentive to the recommendations of the experts, and I think good decisions have been taken in many instances all along. We must remember that not only governments change, the setting is changing and the circumstances change, and you cannot make comparisons because these are not the same. There's not the same level of knowledge, not the same level of experience, and you can't compare a reaction at wave 2 by the same government as in wave 1 by the same government, let alone when governments change. So I don't think making these comparisons is helpful because things have so dramatically changed that it's not a fair comparison to have.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Eran Balicer. I know you're very busy, and happy Hanukkah to everybody on the line.
Happy Hanukkah. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.